go. Just pressing record. And let's start admitting people in. There'll be a lot more people coming in. They're always latecomers. We'll get around 30, 40, even though we've got about 200-300 people registered. Okay, folks, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another session on the Islamic Courses, Muslamics. Okay, today's session is a very interesting one, very important, very relevant to our modern times, both in the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world, and for non-Muslims as well. It's a book review discussion on Islamic theology in the Turkish Republic, and we're very honored and privileged to have Dr. Philip Dorroll from Wofford College in the US of A, who is the author, and the book should be coming out in April, and it's hosted by Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, our usual in-house Ottoman expert from the Young Ottomans Foundation, theyoungottomans.com. Okay, quick reminder to everyone, please keep your devices on mute or silent. It is being recorded. If you're not on our mailing list, just leave it on your chat, and there is a Q&A session as well. It is going to be more than an hour because it's a very interesting discussion. We want to get some thoughtful engagements. Obviously, most people haven't got access to the book. It will be out in the next end of the month or so, but please do ask relevant questions, intelligent questions, and that's the whole point of our Islamic Courses platform. If you don't know the basics, probably just sit down and listen and leave it to the presenters to talk. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Yakoob. But welcome, Phil. Let me just welcome you. Let me just unmute you. And over to you, salams, Dr. Yakoob. Welcome as well. Bismillah.
Okay, well, assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome once again to our sessions on late Ottoman history in the early Turkish Republic. I once again want to thank Dr. Philip Dorroll for giving us the opportunity to interview him today on his publication. And I'm just going to go straight to it, and rather than wasting everyone's time in that sense. So if you don't mind me calling you Phil, or should I call you Dr. Dorroll?
No, call me Phil, yeah, please.
That's okay, thank you, I appreciate it. So Phil, if you can just tell me a little bit about your motivations about writing this book in particular, this work, because it's quite intriguing. I mean, I myself who live in Turkey and so forth, that very few people, and you mentioned this in the book itself, who are outside the framework of the Turkish Republic have taken interest in this subject matter. And what was it that made you interested in this subject?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, to you both for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity a great deal. So just the long and short of how I got into this and why I wrote the book is that, like a lot of non-Muslims who study Islam, I kind of have a personal experience that gets me interested. In my case, it happens to be the fact that I grew up and still am a practicing Eastern Orthodox Christian, which means my Christianity comes from the same part of the world that a lot of Eastern Mediterranean Muslim tradition comes from. So the kind of culture, the kind of religious culture that I'm used to from Eastern Europe, Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, I began to see a lot of cultural affinity with Islam in that part of the world, being from the same part of the world. So I got interested in Turkey, got interested in Eastern Mediterranean, Ottoman history, things like that. And as I did Islamic studies, I began to notice that overall there's a narrative in Islamic studies in the modern period. This has changed recently, but certainly in the 20th century, that Islam as a religion does not have a proper theological tradition, and that somehow Christianity has theology while Islam does not. And this is a kind of polemical discourse, I think, that you can find in certain 20th century Islamic studies scholars. What, of course, for me, the whole Ulum ad-Din encompasses theology, philosophy, quote unquote, legal theory. All these different things come together into one organic sort of synthesis. And so I saw an imbalance in the way Islamic studies scholars, particularly non-Muslims in the West, talk about Islam. And I saw that imbalance as being particularly severe when talking about Turkey and modern Turkish. So people in Islamic studies, both Muslim and non-Muslim, I think, don't often think of modern Turkish as a language of Islamic thought. The modern Turkish language is usually associated with the secular nationalism of the 20th century, which is obviously the context it came from. But, and this is what the book is about, there's a whole genre of systematic, really profound, fascinating, diverse Islamic theological thought written exclusively in modern Turkish that comes out of the academic system of the divinity faculties, the theology faculties, the ilahiyat schools, like the one that you're at in Turkey. And so there's this huge tradition of Islamic theology in this language that people typically dismiss, and Islamic theology being dismissed often in and of itself. I thought it'd be good to look at this whole tradition and try and transmit what I can of it from Turkish into English.
Now, what I found interesting about what you just said right now is this notion of narrative in particular, right? And one of the things that I was interested in what you were just saying right now is this particular narrative regarding Turkish as a language of ilahiyat and theology in particular. Did you see this perception purely within Western academic circles, or have you noticed that there's this type of perception in Turkey as well?
I do think it's in Turkey as well, to some degree. There's an idea that, I don't think that Turkish academics and theologians, I mean, they know very well how excellent the work is that is done at their universities, but they often talk about it in terms of the recovery, analysis, reconstitution of Islamic heritage from the Ottoman and previous periods, which is absolutely true. That's the foundation, that's the basis. But there's not a lot of discourse on just the modern Turkish language itself producing a whole tradition of Islamic thought. So in the ilahiyat discourse, there's a lot of discussion about reanimating and really renewing the tradition from the previous periods. But I look at that and I see that, and I also see a whole new way of Islamic thinking rooted in the traditional sources being elaborated in the modern Turkish language.
Right, and one of the interesting things which that I find in Turkey in particular, and I don't know if you developed this in the book or not, but in Turkey there seems to be like two schools of thought regarding the ilahiyat: the Ankara school of thought, and then predominantly what you see in Istanbul regarding Istanbul University and Marmara University in particular. How do you think these two schools of thought, in that sense, coincide or clash with each other regarding this meta framework that you've created?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I actually came very close to structuring the book along that division.
Mm-hmm.
But because, like you're saying, it's kind of an informal. I didn't want to sort of harp on it too much, but yeah, I definitely see it. And as you say, so the Ankara school, for those people who are watching and not familiar, the Ankara school is associated with what's sometimes called historicism, or a more contextual. I sort of think of it as a more explicitly socially engaged reading of theology, no less traditional, but very much concerned with, or at least not afraid to address social questions directly. Kind of, and the Marmara school, the Istanbul school, refers to, I think, traditions of scholarship that are rooted in the traditional sources, but are more concerned with analyzing and understanding and revivifying the traditional sources as they're presented in the text, and is less concerned with trying to draw a contemporary social message out of them. Right. They're sometimes called traditionalists and modernists, but I see them as kind of the same pole. So to answer your question, I see these as this historicist or socially active, and then this traditional analytical scholarship, what you might call a descriptive or a prescriptive method. Right. I see them as distinct, but harmonious and working together in the modern Turkish tradition. In other words, I see them as tendencies that you can find in most Turkish thinkers, right, to a greater or lesser degree. Right. And so I think it's a very interesting distinction. And of course, the Ankara school comes from that early Republican context where the social question is a big question. And the Marmara school comes a few decades later, talking about the reconstitution of Islamic tradition. But I see them as actually complementary tendencies that I suppose in extreme forms can be sort of antagonistic, but I think most of the time they're complementary, and you see them actually in the same person to a greater or lesser degree.
Right. Yeah. You know, one of the things that I notice in works such as yours is like in Islam, there's the continued dialectic discussions, contestations, and so forth that happen within the various factions within the Muslim world or within any given country is usually an issue of authenticity. Yes. The idea of having this sort of like claim of the Islam that's represented is authentic. And one of the things that you're presenting in your work is this idea or this notion of a distinct Turkish, if I can say this, I mean, I'm reluctant to say Turkish Islam in that sense, but an authenticity in regards to how Islam is practiced in Turkey within the frameworks of the Ilahiyat. And there is this attempt in your book to show that this is quite authentic and not disconnected, one from the Ottoman past, but also from the Muslim Islamic tradition. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a great assessment, and I think you summed up my thesis better than I have, which often happens. So yeah, if I could repeat that thesis, I would have used it in the book. That's exactly what I was trying to say, is that modern Turkish Islamic discourse is not inauthentic or tainted some way by secular modernism to a degree that it's no longer authentic Islam,
Right.
and that there is actually a continuity between the late Ottoman tradition
Mhm.
and the discussions of modern secularity and contemporary Islamic thought in Turkey. And that's exactly my argument. And I think the reason is because we tend to see modern Turkish somehow, because it's so new, it's inauthentic, it's not traditional Islamic. But my contention is that the modern Turkish language has actually created a new, authentically, traditionally grounded form of Islamic thought by taking these traditional Ottoman and pre-Islam or pre-Republican Turkish, Arabic, Persian sources and putting them all together and creating a whole new tradition of Islamic thought that is grounded in the past, but is also engaged directly with modernity. Because like I say in the book, a way I think about this is Islamic theology in Turkey speaks the language of modernity natively.
Right.
The language came into being as a modern language. And so I think actually the modern Turkish theological tradition has both. It has an authentic connection to the past because it uses those as its basis. And you can see an institutional development from the late Ottoman educational system all the way through the Ilahiyat system. But it articulates those concepts in modern ways. And I think that articulation in modern ways doesn't make them less authentic. I think it's actually just how tradition itself works.
And I found what interesting what you just said right now, and I just picked up on this, the idea that the Turkish language of modernity it had a sense of, it was native in some ways, in that sense. Could you just give some examples on that?
Sure. So what I mean by this is, like, again, people who do Turkey, we know this very well, but people outside Turkish studies may not be aware. So the language spoken in modern Turkey, modern Turkish, is a new synthesized language that was created in the 20s and 30s, written in obviously the Latin alphabet, different script from Ottoman Turkish, and it was admittedly designed by the secularist Kemalist reformers to cut off modern Turkey from its Islamic past to a certain degree, which it sort of did, and for some people, because it meant that people grew up without being able to directly access the Ottoman sources. But ironically, I suppose, what this did do is it actually created this space where now Islamic theologians, Muslim thinkers in Turkey could engage creatively with all different kinds of questions in this kind of free space that didn't exist before. So they now had to ask themselves, what does it mean to be a Turk? This concept didn't exist 100, 150 years ago. This is true of all modern nations. What does it mean to be, like, if we're going to think of our heritage in terms of this new modern linguistic framework, now we have to redecide what our heritage is. And actually that process of deciding what constitutes quote unquote Turkish Islam, again, sometimes that nationalist discourse is critiqued very heavily with good reason, but I actually see it as the process of trying to understand what this new identity was actually gave this extreme explosion of creative energy and space, where now Muslim thinkers in modern Turkey got to sort of decide, okay, who are we? What do we stand for? What are we going to say? And so in that process of deciding what it means to be Turkish, what it means to speak this new language, right, in that process, they developed this whole distinctly Turkish way of talking about Islam that is characterized by both being grounded in the Ottoman texts and then in the modern framework. To give a concrete example, one of the examples I give in the book is the classical usul al-fiqh distinction between mu'amalat, the sort of interactions that human beings have between one another, and then the ibadat, the actions that you owe to God. This distinction is obviously a very common old distinction in the Islamic textual tradition, but it gets used by modern Turkish thinkers to sort of decide what parts of Islamic practice constitute the changeable and the unchangeable, the core of Islamic faith, and the parts of it that are subject to social interpretation and negotiation. And so in other words, and this happens with the Ankara school in particular, thinks and talks in this way. But this is an example of how they, modern Turkish thinkers use these classical distinctions and then take these classical ideas and then develop them into ways of handling better problems. So one of the running themes in the book is how if you take this distinction between ibadat or ibadah and muamalat, this answers the question of, during this process of modernization and social reform and new legal codes, what constitutes the core of Islamic authentic tradition and what constitutes that which we can negotiate and decide is sort of negotiable and changeable. And a number of the thinkers I mentioned in the book, from most people who do usul al-fiqh all the way to kalam, use this distinction. And so this is why, for instance, this is an example, again, it's well known in modern Turkish for people outside the field. This is the reason why I think in modern Turkish theological discourse, the question of the compatibility of Islam and democracy has been a settled question for over 100 years. It's just not simply discussed, is Islam compatible with Republican democracy, secular democracy? That question was answered 100 years ago using this distinction and saying, well, any system of government that accords with the ideals of justice can fulfill the requirements of muamalat, and therefore is not a form of ibadah and not a form of things that we can no longer change. So this is how you get, so in other words, this is just a way of talking about how you have these ways of talking about what constitutes the core of Islam, the worship practices, the theology, the ethical obligations, those things we cannot change. And then what constitutes things that are socially negotiable, political systems, social systems, and that distinction is taken from the tradition, but then developed by modern Turkish thinkers. And I think that continuity sometimes helps to explain what makes modern Turkey different, how you don't have these long-running debates over the compatibility of Islam and secular democracy. That's taken for granted. The question rather is, what kind of democracy should Turkey have? What kind of structure should that be? So my book is just trying to also explain, here's what makes Turkey different. And I think a lot of the scholarship on Turkey has also kind of tried to put it in a box that is not faithful to Turkish context, trying to say, oh, look, Islam and democracy in Turkey work or don't work. And this box for me is somewhat inappropriate because that question has been settled for a long time in Turkey. If you want to understand the Turkish context, it's more a question of what kind of democracy, what kind of republic do we want to have? That's a bit of a tangent, but that's an example of where I think that continuity can help us think about the transition.
Now, while listening to you, one of the things that some people may make the case, which is that in regards to the late Ottoman period in particular, the Ilmiya institution, which is an institution which is it's framed around the ulama. So the ulama in the late Ottoman period in particular, and there's a lot of works right now making the case that the ulama were not in decline in the late Ottoman period, but actually very, and you make this case in your work regarding Musa Kazim Effendi, Emine al-Hamdi Yazar, and so forth. These ulama who are what I would call in my work, they're part of a meta institution, an institution that regulates all other institutions, right? So we see in the Ottoman military, the increased member of the ulama, the educational system, ulama in the education system, the parliament, constitution discourse, and so forth. And one of the things that people may criticize this idea of the authenticity of Islam in Turkey is a evident absence of the ulama that exist in other parts of the Muslim world, right? And so the early Turkish Republic sort of goes after the meta institution in a way in which you remove the ulama, you remove the madrasas, you remove the ilmiya, you remove the language, you remove the had. It was the Kemalist revolution in that sense was quite specific and targeting this meta institution. And so in that sense, some will argue this is a clear disjunctive break rather than the continuity. How would you place that in regards to your book in that sense?
That's a really good point. And as you talk, that makes me realize that it's a very good point. A lot of what I'm doing is, I suppose, seeing a continuity where it may not be obvious. So, but you're absolutely right. That was exactly the goal of the Kemalist government. That all was a very serious reality. The ulama, as you're saying, was dismantled in ways that wasn't elsewhere. I guess the way I think about this is, you're right. The institution itself of the ulama is forcibly, violently taken apart and destroyed. But I guess what I see happening is, if you read the modern Turkish ilahiyat tradition, you'll actually see that the ideas of those people carry through into modern Turkish, and they actually don't go away. They get taken up in the modern Turkish language and the so I guess there's a perception that because the institution was dismantled, the vitality of the late Ottoman period, which as you rightly point out was extraordinary, that vitality is destroyed and doesn't carry through to the modern Turkish period. And I think that that's to a certain degree that's true in the first few decades following the beginning of the Republic. But I think actually when you get further into the 20th century and the 21st century, the vitality of the late Ottoman period reemerges again in modern Turkish.
Right.
And so part of what I'm trying to do is if you read something like, and you know the constitutional, the political, these discourses much better than I do. If you read a book, if you read the late Ottoman context that I looked at was the work of İsmail Hakkı İzmirli, because he talks in more sort of, you could say, dogmatic terms, I suppose, about a systematic theology. And one of the things that inspired me to talk about continuity was reading Izmirli's works and seeing so much of what he says pop up again and again and again in modern Turkish. And it makes sense, especially in the Marmara tradition, but you can see it everywhere because his works were used by people like Bekir Topaloğlu, the great Bekir Topaloğlu, and Topaloğlu students, Hülya, Alper, Emine, Öğük, and people who, I think Alper in particular, whose work is influenced by these traditions, the Marmara faculty. And so actually, I think that late Ottoman vitality carries through and it gets translated into modern Turkish. And to use the example of Izmirli, just to go on my previous theme about the classic discussion in modern Islamic thought between the changeable and the unchangeable, he has that distinction as well. And he uses that old usul al-fiqh distinction between mu'amalat and ibadat. He makes that distinction and suggests that that's a way to talk about social questions. And then you see that distinction get picked up again and again and again. And the way he talks about God's nature, the way he talks about the importance of religious belief itself in the modern period, and the necessity to have that. So I guess what I would say is the institution is dismantled, but some of its great insights and ideas are actually picked up in the Ilahiyat schools and developed in a new context.
And yes, so I'll kick on from that in that sense. And one of the points you make in the book is this idea that secular Turkish nationalism in some ways fostered Turkish theology in some ways. And this for some Muslims would be shock horror.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that point.
It's, yeah, and you know, this is kind of an odd claim to make, I fully realize. And I guess this is what happens when part of my weakness is I think I'm constantly just reading books and I forget about context sometimes, but what I mean by this is so the Kemalist revolution was obviously a violent authoritarian project, and it forcibly destroyed a great deal of Islamic practice and thought, and that was part of the goal. And that dimension of that experience has been top of mind, as it should be, because of course a lot of the politics of the past few decades have been trying to right that historic injustice. What I think has been overlooked is that, actually, as you're pointing out with the late Ottoman political context, there was an enormous spectrum of political opinion among late Ottoman thinkers, late Ottoman ulama. Everything, and again, this is your field, as you know better than I do, everything from monarchists to Republicans, to people who wound up being, very militant secularists. Everything is included in this late Ottoman ulama political spectrum. And so if you look at the whole spectrum of what people were talking about at the beginning of the Republic, you begin to see that Turkish nationalism did have these violent effects, especially on Sufi practice, for instance. But there were also parts of the Turkish national project that actually produced new creative ways of thinking. And one of the I suppose ironic ways of thinking about this is just sort of, if you look at the modern Turkish context, you'll notice in the past 20 years in particular that this is my opinion, but I don't think people would dispute it, the most sophisticated, extensive work done on the scholarship of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi comes from Turkey. It's inarguable. It's just I call it the Renaissance of Maturidism in Turkey. It's a renaissance of the study of this obviously great Sunni dogmatic systematic theologian, one of the greatest. That, in my opinion, would never have happened if the Turkish Republic had not existed, because late Ottoman intellectuals did not think in terms of we are Maturidi or Ash'ari. They saw themselves as Sunni and then put both of those things together synthetically. If anything, they were more Ash'ari than Maturidi, and they certainly weren't in most cases they were not inclined to say we are one school or another. So you do have Maturidi theology, of course, in the Ottoman period, but you actually have it in a synthetic context. No one's actually doing, we're just Maturidi. The reason why you have in modern Turkey this idea of the importance of just Maturidi is because during the Turkish nationalist period, the idea became commonly accepted that modern Central Asia constitutes Turkish heritage, and Abu Mansur al-Maturidi was from modern Central Asia. He was from, say, Uzbekistan. Therefore, he's ours. He's one of us. Yeah, in a very complex way. I'm not speaking ethnically or racially necessarily, although that discussion happened. But like, in some way or another, he is part of Turkish heritage.
Yeah, can I actually pick you up on this? Because
Sure.
I made notes of this as well, which is in the book, you kick on from Ridwan Hoca, who works with me in the Ilahiyat in Istanbul, this idea of this rediscovering of Maturidi and the Maturidi position, which is interesting because in Turkey, and when you speak to most Muslims around the world, for them, Turkish, Hanafi, Maturidi, that's the stock answer, right? But what you suggested in your work that generally in the Ottoman madrasa, by and large in Istanbul, Asharism was the predominant position, and we see this in the case of maybe Mustafa Sabri Effendi in particular.
Yeah.
Yet there's a rediscovery, you mentioned, of the Maturidi school, or almost like a reimagination, and that this reimagination is a modern phenomenon, not an Ottoman phenomenon, which I hope you started on, and I'm really sorry that I interrupted.
Oh.
But, I was wondering if you can maybe then elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is exactly what I think happened. So if you look at, say, Izmirli or any late Ottoman mutakallim, someone doing kalam of any kind, they explicitly say, I'm Sunni, I do theology, I'm neither Ashari nor Maturidi, for the most part. But Izmirli, for instance, is very explicit about it. And if you look at, like, the kind of kalam scholarship done in the Ottoman period, it's synthetic. Teftazani incorporates all kinds of things. Giorgiani is Ashari, of course, in his commentaries. I'm sorry, Giorgiani's commentary and E.G., of course, are more Ashari, but you can see, like, it's a very synthetic environment. There are some debates, like I mentioned, the famous 18th century debate in particular over human free will, essentially, the extent to which human beings have free will vis-a-vis divine omnipotence, a sort of version of the CASP debate that takes place in Turkey. So you see moments where people start identifying as explicitly Maturidi. But for the vast majority of Ottoman history, you look at the curriculum list, what they're reading, what they're not reading, it's a mix, and no one is concerned to say we're just one or the other. For the simple reason that that wasn't the way people talked about Sunnism. They talked about it as a broader project. It was Turkish nationalism that said, we have to, we're Turks now, this is our heritage, so we have to decide what kind of Islam we have that's different from the quote unquote Arab tradition, the Persian tradition. And so in the late 18th century, I think I get this from a different scholar, Özdinç, Ridvan Özdinç, she wrote a fantastic book about late Ottoman ulama. He actually gives a few dates that I use in the book. I think it's late 1860s.
You say 1869, Ali Suavi.
Exactly, yeah, thank you. Who first start to say things like, you know what? Maturidi was Turkish. He was actually a Turk. He came from Central Asia. That's the homeland of the Turks. And so he was a Turk. And so this has a kind of ethnic connotation in the beginning. I think that's gone now. I think people understand that now. But in the beginning, it was like, okay, we're elaborating a new Turkish national heritage and tradition. All of Central Asia is concerned with that. And so that means we have to develop our understanding of ourselves. And so that led to this, well, Maturidi is, like you're saying, it's a common idea. We are Maturidi. I don't think Ottomans would have said we are Maturidi. I think they would have said that we are Muslim or Sunni or however they would have phrased that, but they would not have said we're just Maturidi. It's the modern Turkish national context that has created this idea that of Turkish people saying we are Maturidi and not Ashari. But I think that's a good thing. I think that what that has done is that has given people a reason to go back and produce the most phenomenal scholarship of Maturidi that's frankly ever been done since his school was founded in the 10th century. So that's I think that nationalist framework, ironically, by shifting people's imagination, imaginaries you're saying, of what it means to be a Sunni Muslim, it actually spurred a whole new tradition of scholarship where we have, in other words, again, it sounds kind of ironic, if we didn't have Turkish national conception of Islam, we wouldn't have the editions that we have that are so wonderful by Topaloğlu on Kitab al-Tawhid. We wouldn't have the scholarship on Maturidi. That's just one example of where I think that this Turkish national context actually, by shifting the way people talk about Islam in Turkey, gave them a reason to develop. In other words, that modern phenomenon gave them a reason to be traditional in a new way. Let's put it that way. It gave
in your
people
opinion,
access
when
to
this was being, sorry, in your opinion, when this was being developed, do you feel that, or do you see any moments of contestation regarding this project, or do you see it as just an empty, vessel that's just been filled? How do you see it? Why is it that Maturidism, in this sense, is just wholeheartedly taken on? Because the reason why I say that in your work, you continuously you're careful of Islam, the religion. You make that point in regards to making a distinction between Islam, the political project, and Islam, the religion. And yet here, when we're seeing that this is, maybe I can argue, a state-driven project, or a project of the institutions which are closely affiliated with the state. This is a political project in some ways. And so here, your work does talk about politics, not just Islam, the religion. So in that sense, I wanted to know if there was any, contestations, people, resistance or whatnot. And if there wasn't a resistance, in your opinion, why do you think that this transition was possible?
Again, it's a really good, it's a very good question. And I appreciate your very insightful reading of my book. Yeah, I am concerned to talk about theology per se, but as you point out, that eventually I'll have to deal with the state and talk about politics. So I think that when this was happening, this happens. So the idea that Maturidi is Turkish, and there's a Turkish Islam that's distinct from other Islamic traditions, that begins in the late 19th century, continues 20th century. But the real state-driven sort of enforcement or development of this happens in the early Kemalist period, when dissent is very difficult. So I'm sure there was dissent to these ideas, but I would have to do better research to find them, because the public dissent would have been a dangerous thing. To dissent against, in other words, to dissent against the idea of a Turkish national Islam in the 20s and 30s would have been a dangerous thing to do. And so I think because that was the context in which these ideas were developed, that sometimes scares people away from seeing them as an authentic development of Islamic thought, because there's a coercive element involved. I guess what I would say is, with the state, there's always a coercive element. And so the Ottoman state called itself Islamic, but was very coercive as well. So in other words, the coercive element of the state, I think, is an extremely important human rights question, but it doesn't necessarily render inauthentic the theology happening during that period. We have to judge that theology relative to the way it talks about the tradition to see how authentic it is, not whether or not it's dealing with it. I guess I should say, the way I think about this is, the idea that the theological tradition is connected to or driven somehow by the state is not what renders it inauthentic per se, because the state always tries to do this, no matter what the faith is, no matter what the country is. The question is, when you look at that in connection with the tradition, do you see a continuity? And if you do, it's authentic. And so I look at this and say there is a continuity, but it's a kind of continuity that's creative and distinct. So the first time you ever have in modern Turkish someone saying Maturidi is a Turk was actually an article written by Mehmet Şerefettin Yaltkaya, one of the early leaders of the Diyanet, a great theologian himself, who was very supportive of the Turkish nationalist project, famously more so than people like İzmirli, who I wouldn't say was opposed per se, but İzmirli was not enamored of ethnic nationalism, but Yaltkaya to a great degree was. He's a passionate follower of Gökalp and Durkheim. And so Yaltkaya writes an article, I believe it's published in the late 30s, just called Türk Kelamcıları. And it's just a list and description of what he considers to be, quote unquote, Turkish theologians, and he puts Maturidi in there. And that list has developed ever since then into a whole subgenre of Turkish theological studies, elaborating the history of Turkish Islamic thought and theology. And that subgenre is a part of the common phenomenon you're pointing to, which is, we learn in school that we're Hanafi Maturidi. And that idea that that's just part of who we are was developed in this early Republican period. And many ulama were part of it and agreed with it. The idea that it was connected to the state is something we have to investigate, because that could render it inauthentic. But what I'm saying is, but because that idea actually led to this phenomenal fluorescence of authentic reconnection with the profound tradition of Maturidi, we can call this development, even though it was spurred by Turkish nationalism, an authentic thing that was connected to Islam itself, because it produced this whole new interaction with the tradition that I'm continually amazed by. The recovery, by the way, of Maturidi as a systematic thinker in Turkey, has parallels with other global religious movements. The recovery of other theologians in the Christian tradition happens in the same time period for the same reasons. So I know it's just I guess it's an ironic thing where I say, if you look at the modern Turkish language, you will actually see moments like this where the modern Turkish national project enabled a new kind of tradition, a new kind of connection with the tradition. It didn't, Turkish national project, the Turkish modern Turkish language wasn't always a break from the past. In some cases, especially when it comes to Maturidi, it was actually a way of reconstituting tradition in a way that actually wasn't possible before.
And one of the things that I also found interested in your work was when we think of sort of like state imposition, state coercion, and so forth, people have this impression of the early Kemalist Republic, but you also make the case of the shift and changes that have recently taken place under the AK Party coming into power, which is a very different moment in the Turkish Republic history. We have a government which has a conservative core. It's an umbrella to some degree, but it has the ear to a particular faction that probably didn't have a sort of insight into the state machinery in the past, right? And what I found interesting is you use this term called secular Kemalism, which is intriguing for me in some ways. I was wondering, in this framework that we talk about regarding Turkey, can you give me a little bit of elaboration on this idea of secular Kemalism?
Yeah, so this is actually something that was an insight given to me, or a suggestion given to me by the reviewers of the book, who were pointing to the idea that, okay, you talk about Kemalism, but what you are really, to these people who are much more knowledgeable in Turkish political thought than I am, but what they were saying, but Kemalism itself is a very complex political tradition that actually has religious and non-religious elements to it. Many of the Turkish Republican supporters were very religious and devout people, and some were not, of course. So the point was made to me during the review process that, like, Kemalism is actually a way of referring to Turkish statism in general. It's a way of referring to the way that modern Turkish politics works, no matter who's in charge. It's a style of governance that kind of maintains throughout the Republic, because the founder of the Republic was Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So they just wanted me to make the point that, okay, when you are critiquing and you're talking about the particular kind of authoritarian governance of the early period, you're talking about secular Kemalism. You're talking about the Kemalist statist project of controlling religion for secularist goals and not for other goals. So they basically wanted me to say, this is a way of signaling to your readers that you were talking about this early Republican period, and then the continuing ideology of secularism, of laiklik, but the particular kind of laiklik where it's a project that's intending to forcibly decrease the visibility of Islam in the public sphere and practice in the public sphere. And that's one element of the Kemalist project, but there's other ways that the Turkish state can relate to religion, and so they wanted me to just make that distinction.
And do you think that this framework of secular Kemalism has changed during the coming of the AK Party to government, and in the current period?
It's a complicated question. I mean, I think that there's a debate. I mean, people know this. I'm not, there's a debate in Turkey now of the history of AK Party governance since it came to power in 2002. And so I think in the AK Party you find actually a wide spectrum of opinion. But I think I think the great success of the AK Party in the beginning of its tenure was founded on the fact that it introduced a whole new way of governing Turkey that actually was distinct from the previous Kemalist past. It talked in terms of democratic pluralism as being an inherently good thing, and that, for instance, I think I maybe even mentioned this in the book. I think I do. One of the interesting things about the early AK Party political program, the document first put out in 2002, or maybe 2001 actually, they used the famous phrase taken from, I don't know if it's British or American English, if one of us isn't free, none of us are free. So there's this kind of commitment to pluralism and democratic policy making in the beginning. So that was obviously very different from the previous Turkish administrations. I mean, that was obviously a whole new way of talking about politics in Turkey. Debates continue over the extent to which AK Party governance has changed or not, but I think the AK Party, certainly in its inception, is a whole different way of talking about politics in Turkey, and that's why there was such mass support for it.
Right. Now, one of the things I didn't touch upon, and I should have to some degree, is we talk about the ilahiyat departments in Turkey and the influence on sort of like Turkish theology, but I didn't touch upon the Diyanet itself, which is mentioned in passing. But I wanted to ask you in that sense, in terms of how have you seen the evolution of the role of the Diyanet in regards to the way, I mean, the Diyanet and the theology departments in some ways, many people won't know, are distinct in terms of authority and jurisdiction, but many of the individuals are interconnected in many ways that create this connectivity. So how do you see the role of the Diyanet in regards to this idea of Turkish theology, in regards to, some people make the case that the Diyanet should be independent from the state, other people feel that the Diyanet's main function is to operate under the state, and if that's the case, then religion in particular is somehow or somewhat coerced and compromised?
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, a really important, good question. I think I'm taking from other scholars who know more about this than I do, but I see the Diyanet as one of those institutions that actually represents great continuity from the Ottoman period. And I see it as something that the Ottoman state also asserted the authority to authorize or license or even control to a certain degree religious discourse and practice in the Ottoman Empire. And the modern Turkish state takes up that authority as well and asserts jurisdiction basically over religious practice in the country, and says, if we're going to have a Sunni Muslim infrastructure, which of course there is, and we're going to have, that infrastructure has to be licensed and approved by this ministry. And this is not, this is something I see as being just taken directly from the Ottomans and then developed into a new Turkish version. So I see it as kind of a long-standing feature of governance in this part of the world. And I think you could probably trace it back to even further before the Ottoman Empire. I think it's a long-standing, the idea of centralizing religious tradition, I think goes back even further than just the Ottomans, of course. In the modern period, I think, so the argument I'm trying to make in the book, I suppose, about this in terms of politics is that the Diyanet, you know, like all institutions, there's some ups and downs or positive and negatives. One of the capacities it has is that it has the capacity to produce enormous levels of religious scholarship, religious development intellectually. This to take again the example of the Renaissance of Maturidism would have been completely impossible without the Diyanet. Its resources, its coordination, it's the way that it operates, the way that it coordinates and directs resources was a huge part of this huge fluorescence of Maturidi scholarship. It was also a big part of the whole Renaissance in Islamic thought in the past 20 years in modern Turkey, in contemporary Turkey. But kind of the flip side to that is, by retaining that jurisdiction, it also has the ability to restrict or to discourage the development of other kinds of theology. And so it's just a sort of, that model exists in Turkey and it has its ups and its downs. I think in other words, I think there are ways that it can be used to encourage diversity of thought, to encourage Islamic intellectual activity, and ways that it can be used to do the opposite. But I guess I don't see that. I guess what I'm saying is I don't see that as an inherently, the Diyanet structure is very much a quote unquote Turkish thing. But the idea that the state will try to intervene and control religion is not a Turkish thing. It happens everywhere. And so the Diyanet is kind of the Turkish model for this. But I think that question of the state asserting jurisdiction or not is a very common phenomenon. But the way it occurs in Turkey is through the Diyanet. I guess what I'm saying is I don't have a positive or negative evaluation of the Diyanet. I just see it as a common feature of the Turkish system, and it has ways that it can benefit the tradition immensely and ways that it can complicate it. But I guess I would say is, the way I talk about in the book is, if you want to talk about the future of Islamic thought in Turkey, the way it could develop in the future, the way that Islamic theology could develop in the next coming decades, you'll have to watch closely the Diyanet.
Right.
It has that capacity, and so the way that it behaves will help determine the course of the way theology develops in the country.
Yeah, and this is one of in the last chapter of your book, you talk about futures and this idea, and it's an interesting chapter in many ways because you talk about it's the chapter of a discussion, whereas in the previous chapters it's the chapters of what happened and so forth. But here you want to look at the possibilities of the future. And what was your I saw some of the conclusions you made, but and there's one that I think is very interesting, which is missing in the book, which I'll come to in a second. But what was your thought process of including this chapter in the book, in the idea of thinking about the possibility of the future direction in that sense, which is quite creative, actually?
I'm sorry, go ahead, sorry.
It's very creative to have that, to put a chapter in regarding foresight.
Well, I appreciate that. This again comes from people giving me important critiques and suggestions, which is, people mention that like you have to talk about, and this goes back to actually my dissertation advisor, Vincent Cornell, told me this a number of times, and it was the inspiration for this. You have to talk about the political. I mean, my instinct is always talk about systematic theology in a vacuum because I think it's so fascinating and so interesting, but you have to at some point address the political and address the way the political interacts with this rarefied discourse of academic theology. And so I said, yeah, I need to have a chapter where I talk about the way in which the political really distinctively interacts with the theological in modern Turkey. And that's the DNet. The DNet is the way in which the political really interacts with theology in modern Turkey. And so I thought, well, that's a good way to talk about the future of this heritage. So what is it, in other words, if we think about looking forward, what is it that could decisively condition the directions of Islamic thought in Turkey? My basic argument is that the tradition itself, the modern Turkish language tradition itself, is so robust and so rich that it lacks nothing in terms of its own creativity or potential for development. It can do whatever it wants. It has the same kind of sophistication as any other modern, it's a modern theological language like any other. And so it can go in all kinds of different directions. So that's not a restriction. The Turkish language itself and the modern Turkish secular context is not a restriction, in my opinion. So what are the potential things that could restrict or could condition politically what happens in the future? And I think it's this context of Turkish statism where the DNet does have the capacity to encourage or discourage development of certain specific theological discourses. And so it's basically, my argument is basically saying, okay, if we're going to discuss how the political intersects with the theological in Turkey, that's the structure of the DNet. And it's used by every political institution in the country, no matter who's in charge. It's just a feature of governance. And so that's a way of us talking about, if the DNet begins to approve of something and encourage it, it's going to really help it along. Right. If the DNet begins to express disapproval, it doesn't end it, but it makes it harder. It makes it more difficult. And again, this is just the reality of human life, here in Dunya, right? I mean, that's just the way of the world. In every country, there's a political development that has the same effect. In the US, there's similar political factors that restrict or elaborate religious practice and discourse. But the Turkish context that does that is the DNet. So me talking about the DNet is just a way of saying, here's how we should think about the political when it comes to Islamic thought. And this is also part of me saying, I really don't like talking in terms of Islamist versus secularist in Turkey. I mean, this is not just me, but like, I really think it's an unhelpful framework to talk about there are secularist people and there's Islamists in Turkey, and that somehow explains the divisions. And I think that's just not the case at all. There's all different kinds of Islamic practice, and I think secularity is presumed by nearly everybody to some degree. So if it's not an Islamist secularist divide in Turkish politics, what is the political question? I think the political question is, what is the extent of the jurisdiction of the state over religion? And both sides in Turkish politics, if you will, agree that the state does have some kind of role, but the question is, what is that role? What can it do? And that's the question that will really determine the future of Turkish theology on the political sense. And that's the question of the DNet.
Okay, and this will be my last question, and then we'll open up for Q&A if that's okay. And so, as I said, there was when I was reading this chapter on futures for somebody like myself who lives in Turkey and so forth, one of the things that I would have, it's not in the book, but I'm interested in your thoughts, is the Syrian migration question, which is members of, so there's many Syrians who are here. There's members of the ulama from Syria who are here now, who are contributing to the discourse of the idea of Islam in Turkey. There are members of Syrian members who are in various ilahiyats around the country. I don't think there's somebody at the moment who's in the DNet, but definitely there are ulama who are teaching on the side. And there is an interaction, a natural, what you can call discursive interaction that's taking place in Turkey. And there's members of the Muslim Brotherhood coming from Egypt, Muslims from around the world, and including Turkish foreign policy. There is a shift and a change taking place. And clearly what we can see on the ground, maybe not in the institutions as of yet, but we can see on the ground that there is something taking place regarding the interaction of different traditions. And I'm not saying Maturidism, the Ash'arism is going to revive itself in Turkey or anything like that. But what's intriguing is, how do you see that phenomenon? which would have been, I know it's every book has its own remit and so forth, but it would, for me, it's not in the books. I'm asking you here right now, how do you see that phenomena impacting the sort of like the future of the Turkish theological framework of Islam within the context of the Turkish Republic?
It's a very good point. I hadn't thought of it, but you're absolutely right. It would have been something very good to talk about. You could add the Uyghur population too to Turkey. I mean, just to reinforce your point, Turkey is becoming a place where, just like you're saying, Muslim intellectuals from all over the world are talking to each other. You're absolutely. All I can say is you're absolutely right. It would have been a really good way to talk about things. It's a very up-to-date perspective that I think should definitely be included for sure. So yeah, I guess my book sort of goes up to like right before the beginning of when those things begin to happen, like right at the I guess my period sort of goes up to the present, but it kind of focuses in the years right before the refugee crisis as I was writing it, basically. But yeah, you're right. This is going to be a very important question. And I think particularly as you see in the next 10, 20 years, new generations of students, I mean, actual students who are being trained in the system of becoming professors who come from different backgrounds. So all of this to say, you're absolutely right. And I think it is something that we should take account of and watch very closely.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for that, Phil. I really appreciate you giving me your time of allowing me to pick your brain and being a little bit difficult at times. What we're going to do now is we're going to open up the Q&A for everyone else who's listening in today. And just, if that's okay, if you will just
by all means, please.
over to Mizan. So Mizan, over to you, bro.
Great, thank you so much. That was a wonderful interview. Okay, so we've got some questions coming via the chat. So Yakoob, I just sent it to you directly if you want to read them out. Folks, if you want to ask directly, just raise your hands on the Zoom and then be prepared to be unmuted. It's a fantastic discussion, very important. One of the things, what's the relevance? I want to start off actually, because this is something, Phil, myself, just before you joined in, what's the importance and relevance of this? Because it's Turkey is seen as a leader in postmodern nation state in the Muslim world. So the important religion is not going away. Especially Phil, you're from the US of A. I know we were talking about, the rise of the evangelicals and stuff like that. So what happens in Turkey and Diyanet actually matters to the rest of the Muslim world, if one thinks about it, how it structures, because for all the militant secularists out there, religion is here, and there's no such thing as pure secularism, as we know. Never has been, never will be. It's always a synthesis and work in progress sort of thing. So maybe yourself or Yakoob, if you could, maybe get into discussion, what's the significance of Diyanet getting this right as we navigate through postmodern society, the meaning of having a Diyanet? Is it going to become like the Anglican Church? Because obviously in America, you don't have this, okay? You don't have the Anglican Church, or you don't have a Diyanet, so to speak. So Diyanet's probably the closest thing to Diyanet could be the Anglican Church, because the Anglican Church sits as lawmakers in Britain. So I mean, because obviously Pakistan is trying to clean up its situation with its ulama and its religious institutions, and it's looking to Turkey for leadership, and maybe to some extent Russia because of the whole Maturidi tradition. And we have a lot of folks from Indonesia as well watching here. So what does it mean? Because Indonesians are Shafi, but the Asharis in terms of school. But again, the structures, there's a lot of similarities in sort of post-modernity and movements with the Indonesians and the Turks. So maybe Phil or Yakoob, if you want to add to that. And what does getting Diyanet right, what's the significance of it for the Muslim countries in the Muslim world, number one? And secondly, what does it mean for non-Muslim countries with Diyanet as well? Because this is something, because we always see in Germany complaining about Diyanet having a influence in the religious institutions and communities of Turkey, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, so if you don't mind, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so what's important to me about my entire area of research in modern Turkey is that the question of the relationship between religion and state has been resolved by no one in the modern period, but it's concerned to everyone. And we in the English-speaking world just don't know anything or don't know much about how modern Turkish thinkers have handled it. So my only goal in my research is to just expose people to, we talk about the state-religion relationship all the time in every context, Islam, Christianity, whatever. And we know about all different kinds of examples of trying to deal with it, but we just don't know much about how modern Turkish theologians have tried to talk about this. And so the whole point of my research is just to get those voices out there and say, listen to the way they talked about this, and we might learn something about that broader question. So yeah, I think that I guess what I would say is I don't think.
Do you think Saudi would copy it, given that now Saudi is following a sort of Kemalist approach to religion? This is the irony of everything. The Saudis have been always the nemesis.
I don't know that there's a system that I don't think there's a system that everyone can or should use.
Right.
Like I definitely wouldn't recommend one particular model to every country.
Right.
I have my opinions about how each system works well or doesn't well, but I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all model. Right. I just think that there are some insights coming from the modern Turkish discussion that we don't hear enough in English.
Yakoob, do you want to read out some of the questions in the chat?
So
and folks, if you want to ask questions, please raise your hands and put it into chat. It's a very important subject and very relevant to our societies today.
Okay, Phil. So we have a question from Bilal Tonyala, who says, have you noticed other patterns of it's ours narrative other than Turkish Hanafi Maturidi patterns in the Turkish Ilahiyat scholarship?
That's a good question. Let me think. Well, I think Rumi, actually, there's a book on this written by someone else, Mark Soileau, Soileau, who wrote a whole book on this about Sufism, and wrote a similar kind of narrative talking about how the development of who belongs to the Turkish Sufi tradition. And I think Rumi is actually, and this is his work, but Rumi is an example of somebody who's been taken up as part of Turkish national heritage and is considered a very major part of what it means to be a Turkish practitioner. Who obviously has been important for all Muslims for a long time, especially in the Sunni tradition. But Rumi is an example of somebody who has kind of had that nationalist treatment, I suppose. I think that I think the entire idea of a Turkish Islam is what this is. And I think that, again, just to my earlier point, I don't think it's actually a bad thing. I think it's every country does. In the modern period, every country has asked itself, who are we now as opposed to the pre-modern period? Who's part of our tradition? And I think it's a natural thing for countries to do. And I think it's natural that Turkey has done this. And so it's just a part of what it means to be religious during modernity, I think.
Okay. The next question is from Abdullah Al-Ma'mun, who says, thanks for the good presentation. What are the major differences before and after the formation of a republic in religious studies Ilahiyat that you have found in your work? And I guess that's because I'm privy to the book, and I was, there's only so much we can talk about, but our audience, they don't know.
Oh yeah, so that's a very important question, a big question. So the contemporary Ilahiyat system, from my read of its history, was modeled explicitly on European models of the divinity faculties, divinity schools. And so the big difference is that the modern divinity faculty system, theology faculty system, Ilahiyat in Turkey, consciously took up Western European methodological texts and traditions, like Durkheim, for instance, most famously, but others, and used them in its study of Islamic thought and Islamic history. So I guess the biggest difference is an institutionalization of using Western methods, quote unquote, Western methods in Islamic studies. The Ottoman intellectuals were very conversant in Western thought, of course, but they didn't teach them in the madrasas necessarily. But in the famous Darul Funun, the famous Reformed University in late Ottoman Istanbul, they began to do that. Darul Funun develops into this broader tradition of Ilahiyat. So I guess the biggest difference is the incorporation of European scholastic methods, scholarly methods, into the contemporary study of Islam, which again, I think is actually, and actually Izmirli, it never hurts to use Izmirli, frankly. Izmirli is just so important for modern Turkish. Izmirli says, using modern Western philosophy to talk about Islam now is no different than when our ancestors used Aristotle to talk about theology and used Aristotelian categories in Kalam. The fact that Kalam uses Aristotelian categories doesn't make it less Muslim. It's just that's the intellectual discourse of that time. And so Izmirli says, so we as Muslim, Turkish Muslims now must use quote unquote Western discourse now, because that's the intellectual lingua franca that we all speak now. And so that's what a new system of Ilahiyat should look like.
One of the things I wanted to add to that is so we've actually, you and I have spoken about the Turkish as a language, the framework of Turkish, but you and I are speaking in English, books in English. And there are rising Ilahiyat departments in Turkey who are now teaching in English. I teach in the English Ilahiyat department myself, which is in English. And sort of what sort of impact, I mean, English to some degree as a medium is not only, it's opening up Turkey to the rest of the world, and it's opening up the rest of the world to Turkey in some ways, but in a way that Arabic hasn't done in regards to the theology schools in that sense. There is a study, there are works and students who are studying in Arabic, but this unique English is becoming the global lingua franca in some ways. And do you think in that sense that there's going to be an influence from Islamic studies departments around the world in regards to how the Ilahiyat departments in Turkey see themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, so first of all, I think this is actually one of the great features of Islamic tradition in the Ottoman Empire that again carries through, and it's a global cosmopolitan orientation.
Mm-hmm.
The Ottoman intellectuals didn't think it was a problem, but thought it was quite natural and normal to be in constant dialogue with currents of thought across their borders in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is one of the reasons why English is so important, as you're saying, because the idea is, yes, we're a global tradition. We as intellectuals, as Muslims, should be speaking to the whole world and learning from the whole world. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's in fact what it means to be a theologian, to be an intellectual. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that English is being promoted, I think is just again, natural development from the way the Ottomans looked at Islam. I think it's actually, I think in the past few decades, it's been kind of one way. I mean, I say this to my students all the time. Turks read everything. Nobody reads Turkish, unfortunately, because everything is translated to Turkish. I mean, you can find every major Muslim thinker in Turkish, sometimes in multiple versions. And Turkish theologians work with all of this, but we don't work with their stuff, unfortunately. So I think it's been a kind of a one-way development in the past few decades, but I think that's beginning to change. Because of exactly what you're saying. There are now major, and to just give one example, but there's one, the now well-known journal Ilahiyat Studies from Uludağ, Bursa, is, started off as an English language journal of theology that was a kind of a small operation, but is now a globally known, recognized, indexed, everyone reads it. In Kalam sites, everyone reads it. I think that's going to keep happening. We're going to have English language scholarship coming out of Turkey more and more frequently. And I have made the argument for a long time that the next great, if not now, the greatest secondary language in Islamic studies, period, is Turkish. I think more than German, more than French, maybe even more than English in some ways. Or at least it should be classed that way. Turkish should now be seen as one of the great languages of Islamic studies scholarship globally. And I think that's just going to keep developing. And I think that the trend towards an outward expression of scholastic interest is just going to get stronger. And we're going to keep learning more from the Turkish context, I think, is what I'm saying.
Do you really think that Turkish Islamic studies would really become that influential? I mean, I think English, because the ideas are coming from the English Islamic. Whenever I look at the youth, with all due respect, when I look at the young people, most young Turks are not listening to their Hujjas. They're not listening. They're watching people like my friends like Numan Ali Khan, Yasir Qadi, or even one of my friends is Hassan Ali. I'm saying, Hassan, you're a Bengali guy, born and raised in London. You wear a turban. How the mug do you get millions of followers in Turkey? I don't get it. He goes, Mizan, I don't know. I mean, okay, fine. Yeah. But when you listen to the young Turks, whether it's people who are professionals, they're actually listening to there's a big disconnect between, or maybe it's a disconnect between the theological departments and then the missionary departments. Maybe there's a disconnect.
Yeah, I know you're absolutely right. I guess I'm speaking in terms of the sort of rarefied academic world. People in the West are becoming more and more attuned to how important Turkish is. Right. The broader space of Islamic practice that encompasses all different kinds of individuals. Yeah, English will continue to predominate. But I guess I'm just saying that Turkish scholarship is becoming more and more recognized as important. Right. I think that trend will continue, and we will in the next few decades in academic Islamic studies begin to treat Turkish as one of the great sources for secondary scholarship on everything.
I mean, whilst I agree with you, but my only concern is the quality of the tradition coming out. Maybe engaging with modernity without a doubt, because they are they're dealing with postmodern realities. But in terms of traditional textual stuff, they've still got a long way to go compared to the Indians. So, for example, at least with the Indian, Pakistani, Islamic, they have a stronger textual thing.
I mean, I get this is just my personal contention is that no, the Turkish tradition, the modern Turkish tradition, is just as good textually as any other modern language. I mean, that's kind of my argument actually. Right? I guess that's my whole argument actually is that the modern Turkish, and this is not putting any other tradition down. I guess my argument is that the modern Turkish textual tradition has the same level of sophistication as the other modern Islamic traditions do. We just don't hear about it enough.
No, it's true because there's a communication gap.
I think it's a communication problem. But I think once you can, I think that the modern Turkish scholarship, theology itself, in my opinion, lacks for nothing compared to other modern traditions.
For example, if you take the
less accessible.
So, for example, if you take the issue of hadith studies, they're not very strong in hadith compared to they don't have a Dawra hadith up until now, recently. So, if you were to look at the Dawra hadiths coming out, we haven't seen any major works on the great Sunan books, so to speak, commentaries or something. Relatively speaking.
I don't know. Again, it's just my view. My view is that all these fields, you actually have really good stuff that I would class as world class. But and perhaps because you're saying it's a newer context, it's a new language, that's all true. But I guess my argument is that doesn't make it lower quality.
Fair enough, folks. We still got some time for questions. If you want to add some questions, raise your hands. I think there's a lot of Turks here. Please don't hesitate to ask some great questions. Mac, you're a usual questioner from Poland. Don't hesitate if you want to ask a question. You ask very interesting question. Otherwise, Yakoob, just continue the engagement until we get some more questions. We've got some time to play.
I think one of the things I didn't touch upon, and now listening to Phil in some degree, is the Kalam tradition. I think that's one thing that is thriving in Turkey at the moment, and there's a lot of works that have been done on the Kalam tradition and so forth. And that is a segment in your book that you actually put into the book to make that case. And I was wondering maybe for our audiences then, because this is something that has been missed, and this is a slight from my perspective in that sense that I maybe should have given you a question on that. How do you see the development of Kalam in that context in regards to the Turkish case, and in terms of how Kalam has moved on in relation to this?
I think, so again, I think Kalam plays not uniquely, but plays a particularly powerful role in modern Turkish Islamic thought more generally, for the simple reason that it was very important to the Ottomans. The Ottomans patronized Kalam at a very high level in the madrasa system. It had, again, like everything in the Ottoman Empire, which is 600 years long, it went up and down. There were periods when it was powerful, periods when it was weaker. But especially in the end of the empire, Kalam is considered an absolutely crucial, if not one of the pinnacles of Islamic learning, period. And so that Ottoman high estimation of Kalam, of systematic dogmatic theology coming from the Sunni tradition, carries over. And the modern Turkish scholars, just like their teachers before them, just presume that Kalam in Islamic systematic dogmatic theology is absolutely crucial and foundational, to the point where, again, going back to İzmirli, he says unabashedly, Kalam is the highest intellectual science known to humanity. It's the peak of what it means to think as a human being, because it incorporates the metaphysical basis for morality, for politics, for social thought, for everything. And so one of the perhaps, I don't know about unique, one of the perhaps distinctive elements of the modern Turkish tradition is precisely the presumption of the importance of Kalam, and that there should be a new Kalam, the title of his famous book, Yeni İlmi Kalam, and that new revitalization of systematic theology is at the heart of what it means to be a Muslim in modern Turkey.
And in that sense, Phil, we've spoken a lot about modern Turkish, but as an Ottoman historian myself, how important do you think Ottoman Turkish is in that sense? And when we're talking about Kalam in particular, and Ottoman Turkish has a vast vocabulary in this sense. If you can just mention a little bit about that to our audience, that would be.
Yeah, sure. And I will say, and this is one thing that to go with the previous point, with Muzan's point, there is actually one, and I should take this critical point very seriously. There is one major hindrance that modern Turkish deals with that you just brought up. And I think that it does actually make the work a little harder, which is, as you just alluded, the vocabulary size is different. As you're pointing out, Ottoman Turkish was an enormous language and had all kinds of sophisticated intellectual terminology for every sphere of human thought. Modern Turkish is just a smaller language.
Right.
And so they've had to put a lot of new stuff in to flesh it out. And so that is, so that's one potential sort of hurdle with modern Turkish, that you have to build it, keep building it in a way that you didn't have to with Ottoman. So what's had to happen is that modern Turkish has had to sort of create new languages to express those older insights. And yeah, so the continuing importance of Ottoman is that the Ottoman language, I mean, you know more about this than I do, but I think the Ottoman language, I think that I suppose it depends on who you're talking about. If the scholar decides that they want to work on Ottoman language areas of a given one of the Orlum, it's crucial to that focus. If they work on something in Arabic or Persian, it might be different. But I think I think what's happening too is people trying to revive the richness of Ottoman, and trying to revive the rich discourse in Ottoman and translate it into the modern Turkish context, and that can be a challenge.
And this is the point I wanted to make, which is that when you make the case about, in Turkey in particular, in modern Turkey with modern Turkish, that there is a lot of works in regards to the Kalam literature and Islamic studies in particular that's being produced, but a lot of it is still, in terms of Kalam literature in particular, is still leaning on late Ottoman history and late Ottoman literature and Ottoman Turkish. And it's dependent on that. So, and that break is where the challenge is for scholars like yourself and myself, right? And I guess maybe the audience might not appreciate this, is that in Turkey, a lot of the scholars who are working in Ilahiyat have a particular command of Ottoman Turkish. They study Ottoman Turkish. And so while they might be producing in Turkish, there is a leaning on Ottoman Turkish here, which I think is important in regards for people to appreciate that while there is a break, there is still some sort of like relationship and interaction between these two languages, right?
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And yeah, what you're saying, I think I totally agree. And I see it as another part of how I just see that there's, even if it's not obvious, just as you're saying, there's more continuity with the Ottoman tradition and modern Turkish than may seem at first sight.
Mm-hmm.
Phil, have you sort of compared the experiences with the modern Iranian regime, with the modern Iran, and its equivalents?
I have not, because I don't have that linguistic capacity or expertise. Someone else would have to do that, I'm afraid.
That would be very interesting to see the comparisons.
Yeah. I've just been very focused on Turkey because I think it's just an interesting context that doesn't get, especially the Ilahiyat texts have just never been translated to English and talked about. So I try and focus on them. But yeah, actually, that's kind of what I hope happens with this book, is like, I hope it is actually useful for people who know those contexts to pick up and be like, I can do a comparison here.
Right.
Because I think that it's hard to get the fullness of the richness of the Islamic tradition of modern Turkish without talking about these thinkers, and none of them are available in English. So I hope that this book will be useful for comparative purposes for that reason.
And do you think, and have you in your book seen the influence of the Ilahiyat in other countries? How are you measuring that, the modern?
So that's a very good question. I mean, I think that the biggest influence would, of course, be probably in Germany. There's the large Turkish diasporic population. So what's being produced by scholars in Turkey is often being used directly in Turkish communities in Germany, or at least by the DNet structures there. I think, again, unfortunately, because modern Turkish is sui generis and is only found in Turkey, it's only been recently that Turkish language scholarship is being used and appreciated. So I think actually that the influence has been somewhat limited up until the past few decades, but I think again that's increasing and changing. And I hope that in the future, like for instance, I don't know, when I first published an article on Maturidi, I had some resistance to the fact that I published an article on Maturidi like, I don't know, about maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I had some resistance to me using Turkish language secondary sources as just scholarly sources. I don't get resistance on that anymore. People now are like, oh yeah, you should use the Turkish, you should use secondary sources. So I think it's just a process of, in a few decades, people will see Turkish as an influential way of talking about the Islamic faith coming from, or influencing other places. But I think we're kind of at the beginning of that process.
And finally, how are your connections with Diyanet? Because we have folks from Diyanet watching, just out of interest. So they are here, they're watching.
I don't have, I mean, so the way I look at all this is that I have been.
How could they benefit from this piece of work?
how could they, oh my goodness, I hope they can, but I don't have, I guess it's maybe helpful to talk about how I think about this. I see the fact that I am a non-Muslim, working on Islamic tradition, and being given the opportunity to talk to Muslims about their own tradition, I just feel like this whole experience I have benefited from the hospitality of the Islamic tradition. I mean, I have been given this hospitable welcome by the whole Muslim tradition, allowing me to work on this material when I don't have the kind of, I mean, I don't have, in other words, it belongs to someone else. I'm trying to do it justice. And I feel like I'm entering into this relationship of hospitality.
You've done a great job. Yeah.
I appreciate that. So for me, it's like, I hope very much that Muslims can benefit from this. I'm not here to give them recommendations because, again, it's not my house, right? I'm a guest in y'all's house. So I'm trying to do it justice and do what I can to communicate the importance of this to non-Muslims, which I believe is absolutely crucial, especially in the West. But I don't have any specific recommendations for how the DNet should or should not benefit from this, except to say that I hope that people outside Turkey look at this and say, there's a lot of really important, profound theological reflection going on in Turkish, and we didn't know that before, and now we can read some of it. And maybe within Turkey, it might be a way to say, look, guys, I know that you're worried sometimes about, is Turkish, I've heard Turkish scholars kind of put down their own tradition, their own modern tradition, and say, oh, we're so far behind, or we don't have this that other places have. And I'm just saying, from my perspective, the modern Turkish language is as rich, as developed, as profound as any other modern Islamic theological language. And I guess I'm just trying to convince everybody that that's true, whether you're Muslim or not. So I hope people in the DNet find it useful, but I guess I don't have any specific recommendations for how to.
Fantastic. On that note, we're going to end. I'd like to thank you so much. Dr. Yakoob, would you like to round up, close up? But thank you so much, Phil. It's been a fantastic session. And we hope to bring you back maybe on a panel discussion as well. Maybe we'll try and bring, my friend is the VP of DNet. I'll try and get him. And we'll do an interesting discussion, 2-3 way. Over to you.
Okay, well, once again, I want to say thank you very much for Phil for giving us the opportunity. It was a fantastic session, and you've been very generous with the answers you've given to us, and I really appreciate that, not only in terms of your answers, but your time. I know it's very exhausting and to stick it through in that sense. So thank you very much, Phil, for giving us your time. If I can just say something, Phil, if you can stick around after we close, just that we can have a private chat later. For everyone else, once again, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I hope you found it beneficial. Tomorrow, remember, tomorrow we'll be speaking to Sami Ayub on his work on the Majelle and so forth, and Ottoman law in that sense. So please do stick around. Phil, if you want to join us, feel free to join us as well. We'll be doing that tomorrow. But just thank you very much, everyone. Look after yourself, stay safe, and Assalamu alaikum.
So everyone, if you'd like to log out, please, appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'll just stop the recording.
Mizan, I'll be back, yeah?